The worst pandemic in modern history was the Spanish flu of 1918. It is estimated that about 500 million people became infected with the virus. The number of deaths was estimated to be at least 50 million worldwide. The influenza pandemic of 1918 killed more people than the Great War, known today as World War I. The influenza pandemic circled the globe. Most of humanity felt the effects of this strain of the influenza virus. It spread following the path of its human carriers along trade routes and shipping lines. For sure, scientists still do not know where the Spanish flu originated, though theories point to France, China, Britain, and USA, where the first case was reported. The name Spanish flu came from the early affliction and large mortalities in Spain, where it allegedly killed 8 million people in May of 1918. The pandemic affected everyone. Those who were lucky enough to avoid infection had to deal with the public health ordinances to restrain the spread of the disease. Governments distributed masks to be worn in public places. Stores could not hold sales. Funerals were limited. Isolation, quarantine, good personal hygiene, use of disinfectants, and limitations of public gatherings were applied. Young children, people over age of 65, pregnant women, and people with certain medical conditions such as asthma, diabetes, heart disease faced a higher risk of flu-related complications, including pneumonia. Those who ignored the flu ordinances had to pay steep fines. The flu took a heavy human toll, wiping out entire families, leaving countless widows and orphans in its wake. Many people had to dig graves for their own family members. By the summer of 1919, the flu pandemic came to an end, as those that were infected either died or developed immunity. Since 1918, there have been several other influenza pandemics, although none as deadly. A flu pandemic from 1957 to 1958 killed around 2 million people worldwide, and also a pandemic from 1968 to 1969 killed approximately 1 million people worldwide. The novel coronavirus pandemic of 2020 is spreading around the world as countries race to find a cure for COVID-19. Citizens shelter in place in an attempt to avoid spreading the virus, which is particularly deadly because many carriers are asymptomatic for days before realizing they are infected. Each of these modern-day pandemics bring renewed interest in and attention to the Spanish flu, and now, more than a century later, the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic offers lasting lessons for the world in the grip of COVID-19. The questions they asked then are the questions being asked now. Experts say there are 4 key takeaways from 1918. As devastating as the current pandemic may be, the Spanish flu pandemic remains the worst in world history. Secondly, there are key differences between 1918 and the COVID-19 pandemic. Then, they didn't even know it was a virus because viruses weren't discovered until the 1930s. Simply because they didn't have powerful enough microscopes, and as a result, testing simply didn't exist. Spanish flu was also more infectious than COVID-19 and caused symptoms much faster and was far more deadly. Unlike COVID-19, which targets the elderly, Spanish flu targeted the young between age 20 to 40 years. Thirdly, despite the differences, the parallels between 1918 and 2020, in both cases, there was no vaccine and no treatment for the disease. In both pandemics, the most effective immediate response was and is social distancing. The lesson from 1918 is clear. The Spanish flu tells us that social distancing works, and it works best if we act early, act fast, and stick together, and base our decisions not on social and economic concerns, but on science, data, and facts. Is history repeating itself? Yes. Do we have a formula for detecting future pandemics? Do we? If our ancestors were able to overcome the historical 1918 Spanish flu, remember, by taking precautionary measures, coronavirus, like a storm, this too shall pass. If you found this video helpful, give it a thumbs up and share to as many people as possible. Remember, knowledge is power. Until next time, I am Naomi and this is Tell a Tale. Bye.